He had arrived early, as he always did, choosing the corner table where he could observe without being observed. The cafe was warm, softly lit, filled with the low hum of conversations and the faint smell of roasted coffee beans. Everything was carefully curated, just like his life. Successful, controlled, predictable. At 38, he had built an empire from nothing, climbed higher than anyone had expected, and yet every night he returned to a penthouse that echoed with silence. Relationships had tried and failed to take root. People either wanted his money, his power, or the version of him they imagined, not the man who still woke up some nights remembering his mother's tired smile and his father's early grave. Blind dates had become a checklist item, a ritual of disappointment. He would sit, smile politely, listen, nod, and find an excuse to leave. Tonight would be no different. He told himself that firmly as he adjusted his cufflinks and took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. Then, without warning, laughter cut through the air. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't forced or attention-seeking. It was light, unguarded, and real, so real that it stopped him mid-thought. He looked up instinctively, his eyes drawn to the entrance where a woman stood, slightly breathless, brushing rain from her coat. Her laughter had escaped her as she struggled with a stubborn umbrella, shaking her head at herself like the moment was a private joke she didn't mind the world seeing. Something in his chest tightened. He didn't know why. She wasn't what he expected. Not polished in the way his world demanded. Her hair was loosely tied back, a few strands framing her face, her clothes simple but comfortable, like someone who valued ease over impression. She scanned the cafe, her eyes curious but calm, and when they landed on him, there was no flicker of recognition, no calculating pause. Just a small, warm smile, as if she were relieved to finally see a familiar face in a room full of strangers. As she approached, he reminded himself of the plan. 5 minutes. Politeness. Exit. But plans have a way of unraveling when they meet something real. She sat down, apologetic but not anxious, explaining her delay with an honesty that didn't feel rehearsed. He noticed how she listened as much as she spoke, how her expressions shifted freely, unconcerned with appearing perfect. When she laughed again, this time at something small, something ordinary, it felt like the sound reached into places he had locked away years ago. He had spent his life surrounded by noise, meetings, negotiations, applause, but this laughter was different. It didn't demand anything from him. It didn't try to impress. It simply existed, bright and human, and for the first time in a long while, he felt present. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He noticed he hadn't checked his watch again. As the conversation flowed, he found himself speaking about things he usually avoided. Not the company, not success, but the exhaustion that came with always being strong, the loneliness of being admired but rarely understood. He didn't even realize he was opening up until he felt the strange relief of being heard without judgment. She didn't interrupt or rush to fix him. She just listened, her eyes steady, her presence grounding. Her life, he learned, was simple by comparison. She worked a job that paid the bills and volunteered on weekends because it made her feel useful. She had loved deeply once and lost painfully, and instead of becoming bitter, she had chosen to stay open. Not reckless, but hopeful. That, more than anything, scared him. Hope had betrayed him before. As the evening stretched on, the cafe began to empty. Chairs were stacked, lights dimmed, and still he stayed. Somewhere between shared silences and soft smiles, he realized something unsettling. He didn't want to leave. Not because he was lonely, but because being there felt easy. Honest. Like breathing after holding his breath for years. Yet fear crept in quietly, as it always did. He knew who he was in the world. A man whose schedule was chaos, whose life was scrutinized, whose presence came with weight. He had seen relationships crumble under that pressure. He had watched affection turn into resentment, curiosity into entitlement. He didn't want to be another storm passing through someone else's peace. When the night finally ended, he walked away conflicted. For the first time, the problem wasn't disappointment, it was possibility. And possibility demanded courage he wasn't sure he still possessed. Days passed, then weeks. They met again, not because of obligation, but because both of them wanted to. He found himself rearranging meetings, turning down invitations, choosing quiet dinners and long walks over boardrooms and galas. With her, he wasn't the CEO. He was just a man learning how to laugh again. But the challenges came, as they always do. The truth of his life couldn't stay hidden forever. When she discovered the full extent of who he was, the wealth, the influence, the attention that followed him like a shadow, he saw doubt flicker across her face. Not greed, not excitement, fear. Fear of being swallowed by a world she had never wanted. He expected her to pull away. Instead, she asked for honesty. He gave it to her, raw and unfiltered. He told her about the pressure, the expectations, the nights he felt like a stranger in his own life. He told her he didn't want to be admired, he wanted to be known. And he admitted the hardest truth of all, that he was afraid she would eventually leave, just like everyone else. What changed everything was her response, not dramatic, not heroic, but quietly brave. She didn't promise forever. She didn't pretend love was easy. She simply chose to stay, one day at a time, as long as it felt true. And for him, that was enough. The world tested them. Headlines tried to define her. Strangers judged her intentions. His past resurfaced in uncomfortable ways. There were nights of tension, moments of doubt, and conversations that stretched until sunrise. But through it all, there was laughter. That same unguarded laughter that had stopped him in his tracks on the first night. It became their anchor, a reminder of who they were when everything else faded away. Slowly, imperceptibly, his life shifted. Success no longer felt hollow. The penthouse felt less empty. He learned to leave work at the door, to be present, to value moments over milestones. And she learned that loving him didn't mean losing herself, it meant growing alongside him, without fear. The night he realized he loved her wasn't grand or cinematic. It was quiet, ordinary. They were sitting together, exhausted from a long day, sharing silence that felt full instead of awkward. And it hit him then, this was it. Not the adrenaline of new love, not the thrill of being desired, but the deep, steady warmth of belonging. Years later, when he thought back to that cafe, to the watch he had checked so impatiently, he smiled at the man he used to be. A man convinced he would leave after 5 minutes. A man who didn't know that forever sometimes begins with laughter and a chance you almost didn't take.